Brian Laidlaw is a poet, a songwriter, and an educator from Northern California. He earned an undergraduate degree in creative writing from Stanford University, which you may have heard of. This is like the Stanford of Ephraim, just so you know. Yeah. Where he first began setting his poems to music. After graduating, he spent several years as a touring folk singer. He went on to earn an MFA in poetry at the University of Minnesota, and then to join the songwriting faculty at McNally Smith College of Music in St. Paul, Minnesota. In recent years, Brian's work has appeared widely in magazines. He's had lyrics in Songwriter magazine and credits as a songwriting consultant on multiple Grammy Award-winning and Grammy-nominated albums, including most recently Winterland by the Okie Dokie Brothers. Brian recently completed a PhD in English and Literary Arts at the University of Denver, where his work focused on the relationship between poem forms, song forms, and land forms. He now teaches at University College in the Master's in Professional Creative Writing program and mentors neurodivergent poets and songwriters with Unrestricted Interest, a company he co-founded with poet Chris Martin. Brian continues to tour nationally and internationally, both solo and with his band, The Family Trade, and moonlights often literally as a rock climber. So please welcome Brian Laidlaw.
Check. Is that live? Yeah, there we go. Awesome, wonderful to see you all. Really delighted to be here. It still seems very loud and hot. Ooh, it's even gonna feed back on us. I'll just have to whisper. Yeah, really delighted to be here. My first introduction to the San Pete region was through the Utah Humanities Festival. I did some programming with them several years ago. Did some performances and readings and workshops in Salt Lake City, and did some regional touring, playing shows and doing workshops at venues and colleges and universities around the state. And so that was the first time that I connected with this wonderful neck of the woods. I did some programming at Snow during that little tour run. And then more recently, I did a Granary Artist Fellowship residency with Granary Arts, which hopefully some of you are aware of, a wonderful organization based here in town. My partner, wife, Ashley, and I were, she's also my bandmate, we're here writing and recording an album sort of based on conversations and research that we did about the San Pete Valley. And that just recently came out. If folks are interested, that's on iTunes and Spotify. It's called Bird's Eye Chisel, and it's a bunch of songs that are about this place and its fascinating history. The way that I'm going to approach this presentation today is going to be sort of in two parts, two very different, I would say, versions of what my life as an entrepreneur has been. The first component of that is what it looks like to be an artist, to be an individual solo performing, recording, writing artist, trying to make a living, like essentially as a solo entity. And then the second part of what I'll talk about is the experience of starting an organization called Unrestricted Interest with a poet friend of mine that does, as the bio mentioned, poetry and songwriting mentorship for neurodivergent writers, particularly focusing on working with writers on the autism spectrum and non-speaking writers who are communicating using a keyboard or letterboard. And I really would love to have this be as conversational as you guys are comfortable with. The sort of odd truth of it is that I have given probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of lectures on poetry and songwriting, creative writing, fiction, nonfiction, all of these different things. And I'm an educator myself. I teach in the master's program at University College. But never in the context of entrepreneurship. My entrepreneurship is something that has always been sort of separate from my art and happens behind the scenes. And so it's exciting for me to get to talk about it in this way, but also it means that there may be holes in the story that I'm telling that if you ask questions, I might be able to fill. Whereas I can imagine that some of the other folks who come and present in this class they are entrepreneurs as their identity, and they're very good at giving that kind of discussion because they have given it 100,000 times. Whereas if I was teaching you guys about sonnets, I'd be lit. It would be super easy for me. So, and you guys would be bummed. Like I say, please feel free to throw up a hand, interrupt. I'm not precious about it. But just to sort of start at the beginning of this story, the origins of my sort of career as a musician, I think, as is the case for many musicians, were pretty difficult. It is a hard business to make a living in. I started out writing poems and writing songs when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. And after I graduated, I started touring. And it was really difficult. It was difficult to book gigs. It was difficult to rally an audience. This was sort of in the early days of social media existing, but people didn't really know how to use it to their advantage as musicians yet. It was possible to book shows via email, but people were still also sometimes calling venues. It was like sort of a big transition time for what it looked like to be a musician. And I think that the big challenge in those early days was simply the difficulty of trying to stand out as a songwriter. There are so many people trying to do that work. And I would say that at that time I was fine, but not great, you know, the way that many people are when they're first starting to be a songwriter or musician or artist. And it took a while. I think early on I was really putting a lot of energy into getting better at what I was doing as a craftsperson, trying to get better as a singer, trying to get better as a performer, more comfortable on stage, all of these things. And weirdly, over time, I realized that being good at those things is only a small part of what determines a musician's success or failure. And it's something that we hear all the time, you know, like, I think it's quite common for people to complain, like, the stuff we're hearing on the radio, these songs aren't smart, they're like not super insightful, they all sound the same. Why is so-and-so famous and this other person, a friend, a roommate, a relative, who's writing really amazing tunes, why are they wallowing in their obscurity? And it's because it's not a meritocracy, the way that the industry works. It's really much more about positioning and branding and a certain amount of fortune and nepotism too. And I think that once I sort of internalized that and realized that I needed to start treating my music career as an entrepreneurial enterprise, as a business, I started to have a lot more success as a performer. The work that I was creating was the same. The songs were, I think, in many ways good throughout. But the songs being good was not adequate to the task of making me stand out. And so what I started to do was to approach my own career with the same kind of creativity that I would use when I was writing a song. I'm going to say that again because that's like sort of the most important takeaway message that I can give here, is that like there's the creativity that takes place on the page when you're a writer, or on the canvas when you're a painter, or you know, in the recording studio when you're a musician, recording artist. And those are all really beautiful, valid types of creativity. But I think, and as an artist, you're asked to think outside the box. You're asked to work against conventional wisdom, or at least to question conventional wisdom and see how you might circumvent it or work between its sort of rules and laws. And then oddly, I was seeing so many musicians, myself included, being very uncreative about the way that they approached their own career. And by that I mean it's like they spend all this time trying to make their songs totally different from anybody else or whatever. And then when it comes time to put that record out, doing it the same way as everyone else. You know, making CDs and putting it up on iTunes and trying to work with a label if you can, and you know, self-releasing it if you can't. And everybody's career looked very similar. And I realized that if I could make my sort of overall career, the nature of my musicianship and artistry, look different from anyone else's approach, then it would make it much easier to stand out within the marketplace or the musical landscape. And the way that I accomplished that for myself was to start pairing my work as a musician with my work as a poet. And the irony of it is that both of those are just trash ways to try to make a living. They're probably the two least lucrative careers that you could ever get into. They're notorious. Starving musicians, starving poets. These are the kinds of archetypes that we have in a modern society that does not value these things. But somewhat unexpectedly and quite pleasantly, by linking those two things, suddenly it was possible for me to have a really thriving career. And it happened pretty quickly. I had been trying to get records out, get books out in sort of separate paths, but this would have been in like 2015. I first pitched this idea of a collection of poems that comes with a companion album of songs to a great publisher called Milkweed Editions in Minneapolis. And they ended up accepting the project. The editor had heard my music on the radio, and he had also seen some of the stuff that I was doing in the literary community in Minneapolis. And so I was building these kind of separate, I guess, reputations or identities as a poet in the literary sphere and a folk singer in the songwriting sphere. But the key moment was when I sort of yoked those two practices into one sort of brand or identity and started leveraging the successes in one to build more successes in the other and vice versa. So for example, poets don't typically have a good way to spread their collections of poetry super widely. However, because that book of poetry had a music component, I could release a single, I could get radio airplay, I could do sort of conventional musical touring in support of a collection of poems, which is something that nobody else could do. And at the same time, I was able to pitch myself to literary festivals and be the only musician playing at the literary festival. So I was going on tour, getting to play great shows in Nashville, Las Vegas, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, like all over the place, playing at these festivals, but where I was the only musician. And then there's all kinds of super famous authors, and I'm getting to network and connect with these authors, and they're impressed because there aren't that many musicians there, and it's like, wow, you can sing too in addition to writing these poems. And so as opposed to trying to battle it out in the music festival sphere, where there are tens of thousands of people vying for those slots, it was really, in some ways, remarkably easy to start booking these festival appearances on the literary side. And that career sort of continued to build and unfold. It was through those successes that I ended up joining the faculty at the music college where I taught in St. Paul, McNally Smith College of Music. And it also made it possible for me to start widening the menu of services that I could provide. And I'm trying to set this up. Hopefully this is clear. I should spell this out because I'm a big metaphorical thinker. And a lot of the way that I teach is related to that. But all of the things that I'm saying in the context of a music career, I can imagine that there aren't that many people in this classroom who are necessarily planning to have that be their career. There might be folks who are thinking of doing something in the music business, something with a new streaming platform or a new way of licensing digital music or whatever it might be. But I don't necessarily expect this to be like, oh great, I wanted to be a folk singer too, I'm gonna take notes on this. However, I think that there are useful sort of metaphorical lessons to be learned, which is to say, point one, joining two separate modalities of working or offering a product or service. In my case, it was poetry and songwriting. Yours might look like something totally different from that. But instead of trying to stay in a single channel, trying to link two seemingly separate channels in whatever your product or service might be is a breakthrough moment, because then you're doing something that nobody else is doing. And then the next thing that I was going to say, the next metaphor, is that I was able to start widening this menu of services or offerings where most musicians, all they can do is offer to play a show or to sell you a record. That's a pretty limited scope. Or I guess they could offer to license one of their songs in film and video. But by virtue of having this poetic background and this background in teaching, then I was able to start offering workshops. So I was doing these tours to libraries and teaching public songwriting workshops, teaching poetry workshops. I started doing like youth camps where young people who wanted to learn how to write songs would come, work with me, write songs, and then I have a portable recording studio, so I would make recordings of the songs that these students were making. And then lo and behold, the students want to share their recordings with all their friends, and so more people hear about this service that I'm offering, and then more people are reaching out, and so I'm able to do more of that kind of work. And the other piece of all this is that, I mean, somewhat surprisingly, there just aren't that many people who are occupying this space between the literary sphere and the poetry sphere. We know of someone like Bob Dylan or whatever, and Kendrick Lamar, and there's like a handful of really outstanding poets/songwriters who are being seen in that literary space of overlapping pop music and literary publishing, but it's sort of rare. And so that was a space that I was able to occupy that was pretty open, and I could become essentially like the best at it because there was nobody else doing it. And that too is, I think, a helpful message, like trying to slam yourself into a space where tons of other people are doing more or less the same thing is inherently brutal. Whereas if you can open a space that no one else is occupying, then you automatically get to become like the Guinness World Record holder because there's nobody else competing for that particular space. I'm reminded I have a bandmate actually, who's in the Guinness Book of World Records for joggling, which is how far you can run while juggling. And, she ran like almost a marathon. She ran like 20 miles while juggling. What a boss. And it's like, there's probably not that much competition for joggling, is what I'm saying. So the real success was her thinking like, that's my ticket into the Guinness Book of World Records. So the other piece of this that I'll mention is just the value of partnerships. And so, I mean, even my presence here is a great example. It was, first Utah Humanities Festival that brought me into contact with San Pete, and then it was connecting with Granary Arts that brought me into contact with Snow, and then it was connecting with individual faculty members, David included, at Snow that brought me into this classroom. But I'm also doing several other programs with other departments while I'm on campus. And so this idea of network building, I think, especially coming out of a discipline where as an artist you think that you're doing it alone, was quite revelatory. And so I think that can be another sort of useful takeaway is like, how can you find other organizations or other groups that are undertaking things that are similar to what you want and align yourself with them. So it's been, and it's also just so much less lonely, truth be told. It's a hard, lonesome way to make a living, to be a solo touring musician on the road, playing shows, doing the thing. And instead being able to come up with these creative partnerships is just an outrageous and fun way to make it through the day. I'm gonna pause there. Does anybody have any questions about that so far? How are we doing? There's a look of a certain amount of vacancy, but at least it's not despair. Yeah.
What is like your favorite way to create those connections with other creators, writers, artists?
That's an awesome question. Thank you. What's the favorite way to create connections with other writers, artists? I think that actually the big discovery that I made was that it used to be I would think I should make those connections by asking for a favor. And I have now discovered that it's much more fruitful to make those connections by offering a favor. So a great example would be like I was in an arts collective, and and we were putting on really cool shows. And this was in Minneapolis. We were putting on really cool shows, and so we would be able to reach out to artists and say, "Hey, we love your work. Would you want to come exhibit your paintings at this like multimedia gallery space concert event that we're doing?" Or, "Hey, we're setting up this music festival. we'd love to have your band come play. We have budget for you guys to come be a part of it. Or, hey, I'm going into the recording studio. I'd love to hire you to come and, lay down some tracks on this project or whatever. So instead of asking them for something, you're offering them something. And then that's a great way to those relationships always spiral out and you end up doing more co-bills together, or they end up doing your album art, or you end up playing on their record next or whatever. But I think that approaching it from a standpoint of generosity is super helpful. Yeah. Any other questions about this kind of stuff?
How do you decide if the two things that you want to do and combine, right? So you combine poetry and music.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide if they are something that there's actually demand for?
Yeah, that's a great question. The things you're combining, how do you decide if there's something that there's a demand for? Interestingly enough, I would say that I make some of my money by selling books and records, but I make a lot more of my money by teaching about how to do the thing. Not just in academic contexts, but in all kinds of different contexts. And I mention that because what people are really paying for is the knowledge that I have about the craft, even though they enjoy the songs. It's harder to sell art. I mean, especially now, it's so easy to get art for free. So the goal is to find something that is sort of monetizable and that does have a demand for it. And there are lots of people who want to know how to play music, want to know how to write songs. And so the demand that I'm able to fill is much more educating those folks about how to do it than being the only person from whom they could buy a record, lol, because there's so many records out there. And then I think that the sort of overlapping of different disciplines just makes my perspective more sort of peculiar. I do also think that in that particular sphere of the poetics of songwriting, I have really put in the time to be the specific, maybe very serious expert about it, And so I don't feel anymore like I'm having to swindle people to let me come in and pretend to be an expert. I really do know a lot about that at this point. And so, and I think that that's, why I'm teaching that in a master's program, and why that's how I've been able to get some traction on that. So I think that also is a way to create demand for what you're offering is, to have a really good product, or in my case, have a really good knowledge base that you're offering to share. That's a great question, for sure. Anything else? How are we doing?
Brennan,
Keep them coming. Yeah, thanks.
so you just mentioned that you got to a place where you felt like you weren't swindling people.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how when you were starting to ask people to pay you for certain things, maybe it was the first time you'd ever done it,
Mm-hmm.
how did you deal with that personally to value your time or your work? How do you price that? How are you okay with that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that, just to repeat the question if you didn't hear it, how do you start valuing your time? How do you feel comfortable asking people to pay you when you're not yet an expert? I think that there's a certain amount of performativity involved in that. And I would say that having been a musician and having spent lots of time on stage and knowing how to sort of spool a yarn, and also actually a lot of grant writing. I was writing a lot of grants to support some of these early projects, and grant writing is really a sphere where you're spooling a yarn, let me tell you. Talking about how important and how visionary and how blah, blah, blah you are, and how important this project it is for the community and the nation and the world or whatever. And so I think that on some level it's kind of helpful to believe the myth, and to imagine what it would be like to be the expert that you want to be, and then step into that role confidently, knowing that there's no way to actually be comfortable there until you've dwelled there. So it's kind of a leap of faith, I would say. And the sort of next component of this, talking about the autism work that I do, is really, that's really where this starts to play out. Any other questions? Any questions from you guys? You doing good? Okay. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick, maybe it's off topic or we're going to talk about it later. But in songwriting, I've written songs a lot of different ways, coming up with a poem, then putting music to it.
Cool.
The way that I write music now is I'll be playing on the guitar, or I'll find like a lick that I like, and I'll play through that, and then the melody comes into my head, and then from there I write the lyrics. Is that the best way to write music, or are there better ways to write music, or?
Awesome. Now yeah.
Because I'm actually one of those weird kids that kind of wants
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to say. This is great. I'm psyched. I'm back in my wheelhouse. Yeah, I could talk about that forever. I think that what you're describing is the way that I think most people write songs. And certainly when I was teaching at the music college, all my students wrote that way. They were writing melody first, often writing the instrumental part for the song, and then sort of like vocally improvising over it to try to feel something that feels good. Or a lot of musicians who are creating music electronically, they're going to like set up their loops and then start sort of like ideating or spitballing different melody fragments over that. But for me, I write lyrics first, but it's only because I'm like largely a literary nerd person. And then I try to set that to a melody. Sometimes the melody starts to take shape while I'm writing the text. Increasingly, I've been challenging myself to try to write the way that you are, to try to write the melodies first, because I think, again, the way that the marketplace, the listenership works, like they're really drawn to melody first, and the conceptual content of what you're saying, I think, is secondary and far secondary to the sort of appeal of the hook sonically. But I think there's merit both ways. I find that whatever I write first ends up being better in the song. So if I write the melody first, I got a great melody and maybe the lyrics take a slight hit. And if I write the lyrics first, I got great lyrics, but maybe the melody is slightly curtailed by virtue of its, the limitations of working with the text that already exists. Hopefully that's helpful. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to pivot, talk a little bit about this Unrestricted Interest organization, and then if there's questions, I can answer more questions, or I can sing a song. But basically, this Unrestricted Interest is the organization that I co-founded with my buddy, Chris Martin. Sadly, not the buddy from Coldplay, but I think that this Chris Martin is an even better writer than the writer from Coldplay. I know this is on video, but I stand by it. Chris Martin is a poet who I really loved. I had taught his books in classes that I had taught. I was a fan. I was just a fan of Chris Martin's poem. And I saw that he was coming through Minneapolis, and I did that same thing. I reached out to him, and I was like, hey, man, I'd love to buy you a beer. I'm a big fan of your work. It'd be super cool to connect. And he, one of the cool things about the poetry sphere is that you can email basically any poet, no matter how famous they are, and they'll write back because they're not famous. It's crazy. Like, I'll email poets like, I can't believe they would ever write me back, and they write back like that afternoon. Like, wow, I can't believe someone emailed me. So I did that to Chris Martin, and we ended up getting together for a beer and really just hit it off instantly. I was just so impressed by his personhood in addition to his awesome writing. And in that conversation, he had actually just moved back to Minneapolis from New York City. He had been working for an organization that did executive functioning coaching for individuals on the autism spectrum. And that's basically like helping these neurodivergent folks to navigate the demands of a neurotypical world. How do you, even sort of like, how do you prioritize the sequence of things that you need to do to complete a task, a complex task? Some of them were still in high school or college. So like, how do you make a timeline for like an essay that you need to turn in 3 weeks when you know that your own process of writing is going to be really difficult, much more difficult than it would be for a neurotypical student. So he's doing this kind of work in a sort of academic tutoring context. But he said that occasionally, in the context of that work, he would get to do some creative writing with his students. And he said that anytime he got to do that, he was having the best time of his life, and it was so sick, and the stuff that they wrote was totally amazing, and they were super engaged, and it was mind-blowing. But then he would have to go back to like talking about math, which none of us like. And so I said, well, dude, you should just start, because I'm from California, I said, dude, you should just start an organization that only does the creative writing piece, that doesn't do the stuff you don't want. You should do one that's just poetry, and it would be awesome. And that was where the idea for this company began. He really had the knowledge base about working with that population of students, clients. And my contribution was that from having been a musician for the last decade, I knew how to do branding, how to do a little bit of basic marketing stuff, how to do the LLC paperwork to set up as a business entity, how to build a website, the sort of basic stuff. So we made the branding, made the website, printed out business cards, and then started sort of saying, like, this is what we do. We do creative writing mentorship, poetry. He was teaching largely poetry. I was teaching largely songwriting for kids on the autism spectrum. And very soon, we got connected with our first handful of clients, mostly people who lived in Minneapolis and were part of our sort of extended network. And it spiraled outward from there. It was one of these crazy stories where, like Russ, like you were saying, the first couple of times that I was working with clients on my own, I hadn't done that much work with students on the autism spectrum. And yet I had founded a company that purports to offer that. And so it was a really intense learning curve where I would be, trying to get a feel for how to connect and how to deliver on the promises that I had made. But all of the time that I had spent teaching in all these different community contexts, it turned out that I was good at it and that I was able to approach that work in a way that was really different from people coming out of special education and who were coming into those interactions like, now I'm working with a disabled person. Whereas for me, it was like, no, this is just a different collaborator. I've written songs with hundreds of different people, and this is a new person I'm writing a song with. Cool, that's great. And it was instantly clear that the students also really responded to that it was refreshing for them to be approached just as like, yeah, another person who I'm writing with, as opposed to a patient, And I never have had a relationship like that, where a student feels like a patient. It always just feels like a collaboration, and they're psyched and I'm psyched. And again, the work that we were creating, it was kind of self-evidently amazing. The songs and poems that these students were writing were just unbelievable. They were more powerful than anything in a lot of ways that I had ever written. And the ways that they landed with listeners and readers, the type of not just self-expression that it offered for the students, but also the opportunity for advocacy for that group that it offered for the sort of like autism support community at large. These songs and poems were so good at breaking down stereotypes that people had about autism and what that looks like, the abilities and emotional intelligences of people on the spectrum. There was no better way to do it than just to show these songs and say, look, people on the spectrum wrote these amazing songs. How can you continue to believe that they're somehow emotionally incapable of like connecting with other people when there's such deep, amazing connections happening in these songs and so forth? And so we started, in addition to our sort of the teaching wing of our organization, and this is all I should say, it was one-on-one mentorship over Zoom. We have clients now all over the country and many other countries as well, international students. And we're doing like these, usually a 1 hour one-on-one session where we compose an original poem or an original song. I get my recording stuff out. I make a little demo recording of the song at the end and send it to the client. And we also started a publishing imprint and record label that does that releases books and albums by the students that we're working with and by other neurodivergent writers and musicians. And so that's sort of the heart of our advocacy wing. We're trying to get those books taught in colleges. We're trying to get the songs onto the radio. We're trying to get where possible, we're starting to do live performances where we're like showing songs and poems by our students, because in many cases, like I mentioned, they're non-speaking, so they're using like a letterboard or a keyboard to communicate, so they can't get on stage and perform or read their poems in a sort of conventional way, but we're able to do these cool events where we're reading or singing the pieces, and then they're there to do a question and answer session afterwards or during the event or whatever. It has through that kind of, there was no scheme on our part. It wasn't like trying to be clever or devious, but just by trying to highlight the amazing work that the students were doing, more and more and more families saw our organization, saw the kind of cool opportunities that we were providing for people on the spectrum, and reached out to us asking to work with us. And so it ended up being this really amazing engine of self-promotion that was quite accidental. We have now started training our second round of teaching writers. So we're scaling up the operation, making it possible for more people to work with more clients, to accommodate a wider population of students to work with. And we still have not sent out a single marketing email ever. It has been entirely word of mouth, and it has been entirely generated by the artwork itself, because that's going out into the world. People hear it and they're psyched. People reach out and say they want to work with us. We've had a couple of different family foundations reach out to us and offer to give us giant amounts of money. We haven't been applying for grants, but they've heard about us through this network and have funded our operation because they believe in what we're doing and find it to be powerful and useful. I feel unbelievably lucky for that to be the case. And at the same time, I think the huge difference, and this is sort of like the big takeaway, is that when I was doing my own private, life as a songwriter, a solo songwriter, that was about me. That was about my own feelings and my own expression, and like, can you please pay attention to me, because what I'm saying is so important and so smart. And that was, to a certain extent, trying to swim upstream. There's a lot of people trying to offer that same thing to the world. Conversely, with unrestricted interest, what we're doing is just not about me at all. It's so outward focused, and it's so dynamic as a result of that. It is something that, like my songs, I don't think the world needs my songs. That's laughable. There's so many songs out there. Nobody needs anybody's songs anymore. Music could stop being produced and there would still be plenty of frickin' songs. It's like, we're not running out. You won't be able to listen to all of them no matter what. But what we're offering through unrestricted interest, I believe that the world categorically needs, and that it is categorically changing the lives of the students and families that we work with. Moreover, it's categorically changing the fabric of society and the way that people understand neurological difference, the way that people relate to individuals who maybe have minds that are different from their own. And I think that to me is like, it's interesting that that's the project that just developed its own legs, that developed its own perpetual motion magic machine that is, self-generating, self-propagating. And I'm still making my own music. I've got a new album coming out with a record label in Portland next week on vinyl, and I'm psyched, and I'm touring, and I'm doing all of that. And, it's like I'm doing radio interviews and newspaper interviews about that kind of stuff too, still playing my own songs. But the importance of that has dramatically shifted in my life. And now I feel like, I feel excited to write my own songs, but I feel like the contribution that I'm making to society is being made through the work that I'm doing with these incredible writers on the autism spectrum. So I'm gonna pause there, and we just got a couple minutes left. I hope that's useful in some way. Does anybody have any questions about any of this, or is everybody just putting objects in bags? How are we doing? Yeah, thanks.
Fun question. I was late, so you might have already mentioned
Yeah, no worries.
this, but who are some of your favorite music artists?
Oh, yeah.
Or favorite albums?
Yeah, that's a great question. My biggest, most favorite record is Neutral Milk Hotel's album In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. That was an album that categorically changed my life when I first heard it. Ditto for Bruce Springsteen's album Nebraska. which he recorded on a 8-track that fell into a lake, and then he dredged it back out, and it sounded really weird. Contemporary musicians, I love Regina Spektor, Joanna Newsom, perpetual Bob Dylan fan, Leonard Cohen fan, Gillian Welch, David Rawlings. Folk, weird folk. I also really love Sophie Tucker and Polo Pan, some more weird psychedelic desert trance music. So get psyched. Yeah, wide variety. Yeah, totally. Thanks for asking. Yeah, thanks so much.
Rock climbing in the Bucks Canyon, Maple Canyon.
Yeah, definitely. I've climbed in Maple a bunch. Yeah, totally. Amazing spot. Awesome, friends. Well, oh yeah, did you have one more?
Yeah, that's you play something.
Oh, yeah, let's do it like this, because I know we're at time. So everyone can jet, and I'll still sing a song if folks want to stick around and listen, but you can leave.